delighted now to be joined on this show by author Marian Broderick. Good afternoon, Marian. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
All good, thank you very much. So, you've taken on a very important task, and that is compiling stories of Irish women.
That's right. Yes, I've always had a great interest in Irish history. In fact, I was brought up, my both of my parents were Irish. One from Donegal, my mum was from Donegal, and my dad was from County Limerick. And yeah, we had a great interest in history in our home. And then I combined it with my own interest in women's studies as I grew older, and they just dovetailed very nicely together. I found lots of under-researched stories.
Yeah, because you do find actually that I did a podcast series there last year with the Donegal County Museum, and it was to mark the decade of the centenaries. And you do find that thinking of events like that, you think about men more so, but it was amazing the amount of women that were involved.
That's right, absolutely, and I think that really came to the fore with the decade of centenaries because I remember when I published my first book, Wild Irish Women, back in 2001. There wasn't that much going on. You know, you go into bookshops and there wouldn't really be biographies about the women who were active in that decade. But you know, fast forward to 2016, and they were all on the sides of buses and for all over Liberty Hall in Dublin and thing. It was a very different scenario. Yeah.
Yeah. So talk to us a bit about the Donegal women that feature. We'll start first with Kay McNulty, who was quite the inspirational figure.
Yes, I love the story of Kay McNulty. She's from Creeslough, and she was born in 1921, and she had quite interesting parents actually. Her father was orphaned when he was quite young, and he went off to Philadelphia to be a stonemason, and he became active in politics when he was out there in Irish politics and the struggle for independence. And when he came back in about 1914, he became active. He became an active member of the Irish Volunteers, and in fact, he was arrested on the night of Kay's birth in 1921. It was February 1921. He was hiding out in the hills, but he decided to come home and see his wife and hopefully his new baby. And he was pinched. He was taken off, and he spent the whole of well over a year in prison. So this was not a great experience, but it just shows you the tumultuous times into which he was born.
Absolutely.
So shortly after that, once he was released, they decided to head back to Philadelphia. And that's really where Kay started to get her major breaks. She turned out to be an absolute whiz at mathematics. And she is, one of the very few women there's a thing called the International Hall of Fame, Women in Technology
Hmm.
International Hall of Fame. And she managed to get into that and be enrolled in that because during the war, when America joined the war after Pearl Harbor, she became what they call the mother of computer programming. So, war creates a lot of technology, there's a lot of innovation. And they were in Philadelphia, they were creating brand new computers. And the job of the computers was to calculate the trajectory of shells coming out of guns so that they could be aimed and fired accurately. And Kay got involved in that. And she, was right at the forefront of that and writing the very first computer programs for that. Just in her 20s, she'd been poached as a gifted mathematician from the University of Philadelphia.
And it's amazing, even the programming, it is such a massive thing now. But for it back then and for Kay to be, among the first getting involved in that is massive.
It's absolutely massive. I mean, we're talking about the 1940s, and think about the computers we have now. The first computer she had to work on was 30 tons.
Yeah.
That was the weight of it. And before her future husband, it was that co-invented this computer. She was having to do all the calculations by hand. So they had to come up with things like firing sheets for the guns, and she had to decide by hand and calculate where the shells were going to land. And it wasn't just the size of the muzzle, the size of the shell, it was humidity, it was the weather, it was air temperature, it was the terrain, and it took 40 hours to calculate one line of firing information, and it went down to 3 or 4 a minute once they got this computer. But nobody knew how to code a computer.
Yeah.
So Kay and a team of women, and they got women in because the men were being seconded off to active service. So they wanted to hand over this job to the women behind the scenes, of course. And it was so secret that she wasn't even allowed in the room with the computer when she first started coding for it.
My
But
God.
eventually, they did allow her. She trained other women to do what she did, and afterwards she became very adept at computer programming. And afterwards, she married the co-inventor of it, John Maudsley, and she carried on. Although she got no credit, none of the women ever got any credit for this
Yeah.
until much later in the 90s, where she started to talk about her experience of early computer programming. And as I say, she and her team were inducted into the Technology Hall of Fame. And also, I believe there's an award, an academic scientific award named for Kay McNulty in Letterkenny,
Mm-hmm.
and um, there's a building in a university, in one of the universities in Dublin, that's named after her. So she lived long enough to see
Yeah, well, that's
to
the
be
good thing because so
recognised.
many don't.
Yes,
And yeah,
that's
it's
right.
posthumously they're recognized. So it's amazing that, she did live to see that and that they did recognize, she was kind of a pioneer in what she was doing.
Absolutely. I think she was a pioneer. And think about the life. When she was born, as I say, it was tumultuous times during the War of Independence, and the family spoke Irish. That's what they spoke. When they went to Philadelphia, that's what they were speaking in the home. And it was only when her big brothers went to school in the classic style of migrant families everywhere, the older siblings go off to school, and then the younger ones find it easier to learn English. And that's how she learned English while she was in the States. And so you go from that. Her mother was very much a driving force and was very keen for her to, show what Irish immigrants could do. They were very aspirational from that point of view. That's why education was important. And it's great that what she came from and what she got to, in one life. It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. And another lady you feature is Nuala O'Donnell. She's quite a different character then, on the other hand.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The other end of history, really. The women in this book cover about 1,000 years, but I've gone back to with Nuala. She was, as you will remember, she was the sister of Red Hugh O'Donnell, and who was the O'Donnell, the clan chief of the
Hmm.
O'Donnell, and he died in 1602. There were massive skirmishes. Crown forces were closing in on all of the ancient Gaelic Ulster aristocracy, including the O'Donnell and the O'Neill. And on one day in 1607, uh, the O'Donnell and the O'Neill and their entourage of 99 had to flee for their lives. They got a message that all of their lives were at risk, and they had to drop everything and rush to Rathmullen Bay off on Lough Swilly to a French ship and take off. And Nuala was the most senior aristocrat woman aboard. So as the sister, Red Hugh by then was dead. He'd been poisoned in Spain by English spies. But the new chief of the O'Donnell was her brother Rory. So she, with her remaining siblings and the O'Neill, they took off for the continent to see if they could find help from Spain. Spain had been promising help to these earls, the flight of the earls, this was called, for some time. But they got into bad weather and they landed in France, and so there was a huge international diplomatic problem then, because they had to make their way from France through Italy to Spain and settle somewhere. And they didn't make it. So Nuala's two brothers did not make it. It was only the following year in 1608 that they were poisoned as well. They both died young. And it was Nuala, really, when I think about Nuala O'Donnell and I think of her O'Donnell, I think of her as the last woman standing. She was the
Mm.
last one of her generation. And it was down to her then to try to protect the next Hugh O'Donnell, her nephew, her brother's son, and try to sort of, uh, you know, push his case, get his pension from the king, plead his court with King James the and save his life essentially.
And how she even
So
kept going through that. Anybody else, would be like, I'm going to
yeah.
hide out in safety here.
Well, that's right. Yes, it's extraordinary. She must have had enormous strength of character because she didn't just do it for her own nephew. She did it for two nephews, both confusingly called Hugh O'Donnell, and she also did it for the O'Neill children as well. And she had them all educated. They were educated by Franciscans. And at one point, she approached the English ambassador um, to try and strike a deal for him to say that if they could all return to Ireland, that they would be loyal subjects, and the new chief Hugh would repay the king with loyalty. And the king's response was, "Let him come here and take his chances." Now, Nuala's own husband, estranged husband, was at that moment in the Tower of London, where he died after 18 years of captivity. So she didn't allow any of the children to go back to the court and ask for their rights, and she probably saved their lives by so doing.
And the physical, then, we have Donegal Castle here, which is obviously connected to Nuala. So that's the physical, representation then of her heritage remaining.
Yeah, I think so. And I believe that I used to go to a lovely summer school called the Charles McGlinchey Summer School in Clonmany, which was where my mum was from. And you can do trips down to Rathmullen where the ship took off as well, where it's just, you can get a real sense of history when you're there,
Yeah.
for the flight of the Earls when it left. But I do find that when you're traveling around Donegal, it's very easy to soak up the history, and there are so many, ranging from castles to prehistoric features. It's just a very easy place to kind of sense history.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many efforts to retain the heritage here, which I think is lovely. Everybody wants to remember their past.
That's right. And I think that is so true. I couldn't agree with you more. When you're a second generation like me and you're brought up in a house that has Irish culture in it, Irish music, and Irish politics, and you are talking about history all the time, and you preserve orally your family history in a big way. And I think that's very important to Donegal people. It really is. Even now, you see people are very fascinated with their genealogy and the preserving of the landmarks around them. They know that they're special.
So the book Bold, Brilliant and Bad features over 120 stories. Marion, have you got any other of your favourites?
Oh, it's
So
very
many.
hard to choose. I'm sure you can imagine. There's I love the story of Lillian Bland. Now that's another name that people might not know, and another northerner as well. She was from Carnmoney in County Antrim, and you've got to love Lillian because of her obsessional qualities. She became very, very interested in aircraft of every description around about 1908, when the Blériot brothers were doing their thing across the channel. And she just, like a man in some ways, got into a shed and became completely obsessed with it, and read everything she possibly could about it. She joined an amateur aviation group, and she decided, as you do, to build her own glider. And she used things like whiskey crates and her aunt's ear trumpet and the like, bits of leather, bits of canvas,
Amazing.
anything she did. And she did manage to build her own glider.
Mm.
And she had it glide off Carnmoney Hill with 5 men hanging off the bottom of it for ballast.
Gee.
So I do like her. I think anybody who's like that. And then she decided, because of the 5 men got down safely, that she could risk putting an engine in. And so the next time she built an aircraft, which was not long after, she put a two-stroke engine in, which she'd bought from England, and she brought it over to a field belonging to somebody called Baron O'Neill, probably part of the O'Neill that we've
Yeah.
just been talking about. And it hopped across the field. But it did take off, and it flew for about 30, 40 feet, which makes her the first woman in the world to design and build and fly her own aircraft. It's
Yeah.
amazing, isn't it?
It is, and there's so like just flicking through the book, there's so many, and there's so many. You think you know history, but there's so many. I know that's the aim of your book, then, to kind of share these stories that people aren't more familiar with.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's nice. It's nice to have a bit of spice, to have the bad girls as well. I like Chicago May. We tend to spend time, don't we, when we're writing about historical figures, we write about the great and the good, and I think it's fun to sprinkle it for a bit of spice, to sprinkle a few bad girls in there as well. Chicago May was a pioneer of a sort, because one of her many, she went off to America to be a criminal. She left home. She ran away from home at 13. She stole the family money to get passage to America, where she became a gangster. But she was one of the first to use the newfangled science of photography for blackmail purposes. This is in the 1920s.
Right.
So you got they cover a multitude, put it that way.
Yeah. Well, it is fascinating, the story. So anybody that wants to, they can purchase the Bold, Brilliant and Bad book, and it is Irish Woman from